Please be seated, everyone. We now have the blessing of a sermonette this afternoon given to us by Mr. J.Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Linebeck. Good afternoon. Beautiful sunshine today. For those of you that watched Joel Meeker's Friday Night Live last month about the 7 churches of Revelation, I do apologize ahead of time. This might sound a little familiar, but in my defense, this was going to be in January before we got snowed out. But now it's going to be given today. If I could have you all join me right away in Revelation 2, in verse 7, Revelation 2 and verse 7, we'll be spending the entirety of the message here. Everything of the rest of the scriptures will be referenced. Revelation chapter 2 and verse 7, it reads, "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will give to eat from the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God." In this sermonette message today, we will be looking at one of the messages to the 7 churches, not all 7 like Mr. Meeker covered. There's not enough time in a sermonette message. My title, Ephesus, the Loveless Church. Ephesus, the Loveless Church. Let's explore what Christ had to say to Ephesus, both good and bad, and what warning it has for us today. I'll start with some general facts just to provide a backdrop for this message. Ephesus would have been the first stop of the 7 churches in a mail route coming off the island of Patmos where John had been exiled. Ephesus, located on the western coast of Asia Minor, was a major city in the Mediterranean, settled by the Greeks and the provincial seat of the Roman government. Its port vital to the city and other cities in Asia Minor, for which goods flowed in and out. This port was so vital it had a nickname, the gate by which the West visited the East. Ephesus itself had nicknames as well due to its importance, such as the Light of Asia, the Market of Asia, the Gateway to Asia, Highway to Rome. Ignatius of Antioch dubbed it. An early church writer was taken to Rome to be martyred, called Ephesus the Highway of Martyrs. It was a free city. Even though it was under Roman control, it didn't have a Roman garrison occupied in Ephesus. It's believed to be due to their loyalty to Rome. But it was also deep in false religion. Diana was the prominent false god of worship, who was associated with Artemis. Having a thriving economy, they have built a grand temple to their false god. It was so grand that the temple of Artemis was also known as one of the 7 wonders of Asia, or 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was an asylum for fugitives and criminals. With that thriving economy I just mentioned, the sale of pagan merchandise was very lucrative business. The sale of books on black magic were some of the best sellers. Shifting gears now, let's go into the letter written to the church of Ephesus in Revelation 2 and read verses 1 through 7. "To the angel of the church of Ephesus write these things, says he who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, who walks in the midst of the 7 golden lampstands. I know your works, your labor, your patience, and that you cannot bear those who are evil. And you have tested those who say they are apostles and are not, and have found them liars. And you have preserved and have patience and have labored for my name's sake, and have not become weary. Nevertheless, I have this against you, that you have left your first love. Remember, therefore, from where you have fallen, repent and do the first works, or else I will come to you quickly and remove your lampstand from its place unless you repent. But those you hate, that you hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. Back up to verse 2. Christ begins with giving the church some praise, telling them they had good works. They were, oh, I got a mistype here. They had good works that were done, they did in rooting out false apostles and not being deceived by them. They had been infiltrated by a group called the Nicolaitans. These same Nicolaitans are also found in another church and are mentioned in the letter to the church at Pergamos. And if we drop down there briefly, we can get an idea of their false teachings and where they come from. Dropping down to Revelation 2 in verse 14, written to Pergamos. But I have a few things against you, because you have there those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit sexual immorality. Verse 15. Thus you also have those who hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which thing I hate. FYI, the story about Balaam and Balak can be found in Numbers chapters 22 through 24. This doctrine was originally intended to be a stumbling block for the nation of Israel. Eating what was profane and committing sexual immorality were the two major stumbling blocks. Now, there's more to their doctrine, but for now, that's all I'm going to take time for. But the church of Ephesus did their due diligence. They put forth the work, the labor necessary in testing. My best guess would be they used the scriptures to prove out the teaching of the Nicolaitans to come to this conclusion that they were, in fact, liars. And in verse 3, Christ continues to admonish them, and having persevered, Cambridge.org defines persevered as to continue making an effort to do or achieve something, even when this is difficult or takes a long time. And it follows up with this statement: if you persevere long enough and work hard enough, you'll eventually succeed. Perseverance takes time, patience, and hard work in order to pay off, exactly what the church at Ephesus had done, and Christ admonished them for it. But then we get to verse 4, and there's a problem, a big problem. In verse 4, Christ declares, they have left their first love. They had lost that zeal, love for the truth. I'm sure we can all go back in an instance when God opened our minds to his truth. Things in the Bible made so much sense. We wanted to share with everyone. We wanted to scream it from the top of a mountain so the whole world could share in that zeal and joy that God had given to us as well. Over time, though, and in this case of the church in Ephesus, about 40 years from the time Paul had been in Ephesus helping to start the church to the time when John had been told to write, the Ephesians had lost their first love. They had drifted. That same dreaded drift we still hear about today, a typical negative human emotion. The newness wears off. That zeal isn't burning like it once did. We become complacent. That feeling fades. But Christ, as our high priest, intervenes for his people. In a message of warning, he gives them the correction needed to help them rekindle that fire and zeal toward God and get back their first love. He tells them to first remember. Remember. Isn't the ability to remember an important quality of God? Aren't we in a time of year to remember? Remember from where you have fallen. Here Christ is letting them know that at one point he held them in high esteem. But now he's telling them that he is no longer holding them there. Because they had lost their first love, they have fallen. How far? Probably pretty far if Christ is going to remove their lampstand and the fact he wants them to go all the way back to their first works. Christ secondly instructs them to repent. Change from your current spiritual condition. Come to your senses. Because they had drifted 40 years now, they were probably unaware of it. If they had been aware of it, they probably would have repented, and Christ wouldn't have to give the instruction to repent. The third and final instruction is to do the first works. As we're about to see in Acts 19, the first love and the first works go together, because the zeal they had when God called them and opened their minds, it caused them to do the first works in rejecting their old lives. Acts 19, verse 1. And it happened while Apollos was at Corinth that Paul, having passed through the upper regions, came to Ephesus. Dropping down to verse 11, I'm going to be reading from the NIV. I don't like the New King James Version of unusual miracles. Now in verse 11, bringing out from the new NIV, now God worked extraordinary miracles by the hands of Paul, so that even handkerchiefs or aprons were brought from his body to the sick, and the diseases left them, and the evil spirits went out of them. Again, dropping down to verse 18. And many who believed came confessing and telling their deeds. Verse 19. And it's here we read about the first love, that zeal, and finding what the first works were. Also, many of those who had practiced magic brought their books together and burned them in the sight of all. And they counted up the value of them, and it totaled 50,000 pieces of silver. So the word of the Lord grew mightily and prevailed. Do I have any guesses in this room as to how much 50,000 pieces equals today? Any guesses? Nobody wants to guess. That's all right. I did Google it. Remember what we just read. Extraordinary miracles were being performed. Their first love was burning as hot, if not hotter than it took to do the first works, and burned their books of magic. Today's price is valued approximately at $5 to $5.5 million, according to Quora.com and Brainly.com. Large amount. The first love and first works was the rejection of their old false religion of worshiping at the temple of Artemis and burning their worthless books of magic. They seen the extraordinary miracles that were happening and had deemed that $5 to $5.5 million worth of books were completely and utterly worthless, and burned them in front of all who were watching. This caused a big commotion in the city of Ephesus. As I draw to a close, I want to bring Revelation chapter 2 and verse 7 back out again. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will give to eat from the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God. In conclusion, the church of Ephesus had been through a lot, just like a lot of churches through time. Christ admonished them for rooting out false apostles, but over time they lost their first love. They drifted. The same can and probably has happened to us as well. And just as Christ intervened and gave correction to them to help them overcome their problem, this same letter and instruction from Christ can and will help us as well if we're willing to heed the message and humble ourselves before our God. Remember, the Passover and the days of unleavened bread are right around the corner. This is definitely a time to stop drifting and get back to our first love and do the first works.